The past 12 months have not been kind to Hezbollah. In September last year, Hezbollah members across Lebanon were attacked simultaneously when thousands of pagers used by the group were detonated in a surprise attack by Israel. The attack killed 42 and injured thousands, with civilians also caught in the carnage. Israel then launched a brutal air and ground campaign, further targeting the group and its support base. Thousands of Hezbollah's fighters and civilians were killed, and thousands more injured. Over 1 million Lebanese civilians were forced to flee their homes. The group's stockpile of rockets, missiles and ammunition was severely hit. And perhaps most damaging, the group suffered heavy losses to its leadership. Most notably, its longtime charismatic leader, Hassan Nasrallah, who was killed on September 27th in a seismic strike that obliterated an entire street. Eventually, a ceasefire was reached, and the war ended. While Hezbollah survived, they limped back home, badly wounded. Since the ceasefire agreement, Israel's strikes have continued to target the group and Lebanese civilians. At the start of September this year, Lebanon's cabinet met to discuss plans to disarm the group once and for all. Following the cabinet meeting, Lebanon's information minister, Paul Norcos, addressed journalists. He told them, "The cabinet welcomed the army's proposed measures to ensure the implementation of the decision to extend the state's authority through its own forces and to restrict the possession of weapons to legitimate authorities." This week, what is the state of Hezbollah today? How is the Lebanese state disarming the group? And what is the future of the self-styled resistance movement in Lebanon? My name is Hugo Goodridge, and you're listening to The New Arab Voice. Prior to the war of 1 year ago, Hezbollah was in a generally strong position. A healthy stockpile of weapons, a steady supply of cash was coming in from Iran, and they were a pretty formidable political force in the country, able to project power regionally. With the start of the war, that all came crashing down in a dramatic and deadly fashion.
Hezbollah is facing an unprecedented moment of crisis in the organization's history. I don't think any other situation anywhere near compares to the one that Hezbollah finds itself in now.
This is David Wood, senior analyst for Lebanon for the International Crisis Group.
So if we consider the main hit that Hezbollah took during this war, they would be having its senior leadership decimated, losing many fighters, and also having many of its weapons destroyed. And the party's base, and more generally like Lebanon Shia communities around the country, many of them being destroyed or severely damaged by the war.
Since the end of the war, Hezbollah has made efforts to replace what was lost.
Now, the leadership, it seems as though the organization has made a real effort to replace positions that needed to be filled. So there's that, but obviously they've lost a wealth of experience with an entire generation of senior leadership that's been wiped out. With military assets, while we can't know for sure exactly how much of Hezbollah's arsenal Israel destroyed, it's clearly a very significant amount. And with Israel continuing to watch the country like a hawk, with the land route more or less cut off to Iran via Syria, and of course the Lebanese government also monitoring Hezbollah's activities, it's inconceivable that Hezbollah could have rebuilt its military arsenal.
Following their defeat, Hezbollah was not simply allowed to go back to its bases and headquarters, lick its wounds, and prepare for the next war. Under US and regional pressure, the scrutiny has been relentless and unprecedented. The Lebanese state has been watching them, Israel has been watching them, and the international community has also been closely monitoring what the group has been up to. Traditionally, the militant group would have looked to resupply from Iran, with deliveries being sent via Syria. But when its Syrian ally, Bashar al-Assad, was ousted in December and Hezbollah evacuated the country, a major supply line to Lebanon was also cut off. The group had serious problems with the conclusion of the war. With the fall of the Assad regime, these problems were compounded.
Even if it might have regrouped slightly, is clearly, at best, at a very, very early stage of the road to recovery as an organisation.
The war came to an end with a ceasefire agreement announced in November and agreed upon by Hezbollah on the 20th of the same month and by Israel on the 27th. The ceasefire deal contained the usual stuff about ending violence, etc. However, it also included two key points relating to Hezbollah. Point number 6, quote, "The government of Lebanon will regulate and control the sale, supply and production of arms and related material within Lebanon to prevent the rearmament of non-state groups." And also point number 7, quote, "Lebanon's official military and security forces will monitor and enforce against unauthorized arms and related material, dismantle unauthorized facilities, and confiscate unauthorized arms, starting with the southern Litani area." Effectively, this means that the most powerful military force in Lebanon for the past 2+ decades would no longer be permitted to hold, store, or use arms. This process is now underway.
The meeting in early September was a follow-on meeting to the meetings in early August.
This is Paul Salem, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute.
The meetings in early August was when the government took the decision that it was going to disarm Hezbollah. It gave in early August a deadline of December 31st, but it did in that early August meeting kick the ball to the military, to the army, and asked the army to prepare a plan for disarming Hezbollah and to come back within a month and present the plan to the government.
The army's plan is set out in a number of phases, some clearer than others.
The army plan, they said by the end of this year, they would finish complete deployment and taking control of the area south of the Litani River. Secondly, they would proceed with disarming the Palestinian camps, and they would deploy across the country in terms of deploying on roads and highways across the country. That's what they would do in phase 1. Then phases 2, 3, and 4, and 5, those were not given timelines or deadlines.
For Israel, phase 1 is very important enough for it to get its own point in the ceasefire agreement. Point 11, quote, "Lebanon will deploy its official military and security forces to all borders and border crossings, setting up roadblocks and checkpoints along the southern Litani area." Prior to the war, Hezbollah forces, bases, and projectile launchers were located in large numbers south of the Litani River. The disarmament in this area is happening. What remains of Hezbollah's forces are withdrawing to north of the Litani, and the army is moving in. Beyond that, the plan is more penciled in than anything.
Phase 2, the army will fully deploy and disarm north of the Litani to the Awali River, then to Beirut, then to the Bekaa, and then to the rest of the country. Those were without deadlines. The army said, this is our plan, but we don't have enough equipment, money, wherewithal to do it. So while we are implementing this plan, we are urgently asking for assistance, support from the international community.
At this point, it's worth noting that while Hezbollah has started the process of moving back from south of the Litani and disarming its forces there, Israel has not withdrawn from its positions on Lebanese territory, as was written in the ceasefire agreement. Additionally, Israel has continued to conduct airstrikes against Lebanon. They might say that these aren't against Lebanon, but are against Hezbollah. But that will be of little solace to the Lebanese citizens who get caught up in those attacks. So far, the process of disarming is broadly working, but when it's completed south of the Litani, the work could become a lot more complicated. Hezbollah still has forces and arms north of the Litani, in Beirut, and in the east of the country in the Bekaa region. While the government leadership has agreed that Hezbollah must disarm everywhere, now they need to persuade Hezbollah that it's the right thing to do. David Wood again.
So it's very clear that Lebanon's new leadership, being the new president and the new government, prefer to reach a compromise with Hezbollah in relation to disarmament rather than to confront Hezbollah directly. And probably the leadership's best argument to Hezbollah would be that there are no viable options available for Hezbollah other than to reach an agreement on disarmament, in the sense that Israel is continuing its occupation of certain points in southern Lebanon. Israel continues to attack Lebanon on a near daily basis. And key potential donors have made clear that they do not want to contribute large-scale reconstruction aid to Lebanon until Hezbollah disarms. So that's like the most cogent argument that could operate on Hezbollah.
There are potential carrots that could be dangled.
Some politicians have suggested that potentially Hezbollah could be incentivized to disarm in exchange for greater representation of the Lebanese Shia community in Lebanon's state institutions. But these proposals would be very controversial because they could potentially disturb the already fraught sectarian balance that's baked into Lebanon's political system. The other thing to consider is that from these proposals, be they trying to push Hezbollah to accept a fait accompli or to try to incentivize Hezbollah, is that process understandably is taking a lot of time, and time is something the Lebanese government might not have.
Carrots, maybe, but very complicated and politically charged carrots. And time is a factor here. Lebanon doesn't have time. Paul Salem again.
One is to try to convince Hezbollah to disarm willingly, and the other is to basically do it, let me say, forcefully with a small f. There's no appetite for a direct clash. The president took about 6 months hoping that Hezbollah would come willingly. So that was all the way from late January till August, basically, where he said, no, let me see, maybe they'll come to the table, maybe they've read the tea leaves and we'll do it peacefully. And the prime minister as well gave them time. When it became crystal clear that they and the Islamic Republic, who sent Ali Larijani to Lebanon to sort of firm up the position that no, they will not disarm, then it became clear to the Lebanese government this was not going to happen willingly, and a different approach had to be taken.
While exact details about how the full disarmament will happen aren't clear, one certain is known. The Lebanese government wants to avoid an armed confrontation with Hezbollah at all costs.
When it comes to everything else north of the Litani, what the army is effectively doing or planning is simply to deploy around the country on the roads and highways as a first step to disable or to prevent Hezbollah from moving any equipment, operating on any of the roads. In other words, kind of lock them down before actually breaking into some weapons depot somewhere.
Wars are fought and won on logistics. And if the Lebanese army can effectively throttle the group's movements and logistics, prevent any resupplies or coordination, then the group isn't really a group. They would become a disparate collection, dotted around the country with no ability to unify.
They're actually currently disabled. Yes, they have weapons in depots. They can't get to them, they can't use them, they can't move anywhere. And the army is trying to consolidate that itself by deploying throughout the country and gaining more support and more strength, and then possibly going sort of bit by bit, going into one depot here, one depot there, and doing it in a gradual way that doesn't trigger a major response, but makes the point that, look, over time, this thing is happening.
Although there have been instances of depots being booby-trapped, which have resulted in fatalities, the general attitude of the leadership is that they are being fairly cooperative. Although there is no guarantee that this feeling will continue.
Even though the official party line is that the organization is united under the leadership of the new Secretary General Naim Qasim, it is obviously very likely that there is several differences of opinion within the party about where to go next, because this is a real watershed moment for the whole organization. So it appears as though there is what we might call, I suppose, a dovish wing of the organization, which prefers to not respond to Israel's attacks, at least for now, and to be more conciliatory in relation to domestic Lebanese politics. In a way, I suppose, either in order to buy time, or potentially to adapt to the new reality on the ground as it exists following the onset of the latest war between Israel and Hezbollah. And then there's a more, I suppose, hawkish, let's say, wing of the party, which would argue that Hezbollah should take a more assertive stance in Lebanese domestic politics and not cede the position of dominance that it's had over the past 2 decades, and potentially to also fight back against Israel's continued attacks on Lebanon and occupation of points in the south.
Currently, Hezbollah's attitude also has an air of having their cake and eating it.
The 5 Shiite members of the government attended the first part of that cabinet meeting when there were other items on the agenda, and withdrew from the meeting before the agenda item of the army came. So they were not present during that part of the government. It's significant that they did not resign from the government. It also indicates that this kind of pantomime, or whatever you want to call it, kind of the way it's been managed, has been orchestrated between the president, the prime minister, and Nabih Berri, the Speaker of Parliament.
Nabih Berri is the long-time Speaker of the Parliament and head of the Amal movement. Like Hezbollah, they are a Shiite party, and in the past have offered their full support to the group, although, unlike Hezbollah, they have no military wing.
So I think Nabih Berri is enabling these decisions to move forward, but is maintaining some distance from those decisions, largely because Hezbollah still does not approve these decisions, and much of the Shiite voting public is unhappy as well. So he's trying to manage the politics of sort of enabling these decisions to go ahead, while at the same time displaying a kind of a reserve or reservation. So that's what happened in that session of government.
Publicly, they decry the disarmament, and yet they are so far cooperating. If in future Hezbollah decided that they've had enough of all this disarmament business, that they wanted to get back to its fighting ways and reignite its action against Israel, then it would need help. And there is only really one place that can come from.
So Iran does remain Hezbollah's main patron. It might be a weakened patron, but it's the main patron nonetheless. And in terms of Hezbollah's long-term plans, the most viable option into the future, if circumstances allow, would be to continue receiving large-scale support from Iran. Like, it's clearly the biggest donor out there who would potentially contribute to Hezbollah in a really significant way.
While Iran would be the obvious answer, it would be dependent on Iran wanting to do that and being able to.
From Iran's perspective, I would say that there's 2 key questions. One, does Iran actually want to rebuild Hezbollah as it was before the October 2023? Because what we've seen is that despite having spent billions of dollars over decades on this axis of resistance, its allied non-state actors around the region, with a view to creating this strategy of forward defense to try to keep conflict away from Iran, that strategy has failed spectacularly in the past couple of years. And for that reason, I would understand if decision makers in Iran thought that it's not worth spending all of that money to try to rebuild a failed strategy. Even if Iran took the decision that it did want to try to rebuild Hezbollah along the lines that it existed before, then the question is, would it be able to? Because as we discussed, The land border with Syria is now all but closed after the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime in December last year. The Lebanese government has tightened restrictions on the ports entering Lebanon, and Israel continues to watch Lebanon and the region like a hawk for potential efforts to rebuild Hezbollah or any of its other enemies around the region. So for all of those reasons, even if Iran wanted to rebuild Hezbollah, it might simply not be able to.
The prospects of Hezbollah being able to regain anything close to the strength they once had look slim. But the prospects for the Lebanese state, if they can follow through on disarming Hezbollah, look incredibly lucrative.
The US and the Gulf countries and Europe have been absolutely clear, and Morgan Ortagus just said it at a conference a week ago, that if the army is serious and shows that it's doing its job, the amount of support that it can get as a military from the US and the international community is kind of the sky is the limit. If the Lebanese army and the Lebanese state does its job seriously, it will trigger massive support. And with that massive support, then yes, it can do the job in the south and the rest of the country. At the end of the day, Lebanon is the size of, I don't know, some municipality somewhere in most big countries. So we're not talking about a large country. So yes, it is doable.
A Lebanon without an armed Hezbollah can open the country up to a lot of lucrative deals. Funding for the army, yes, but also reconstruction funds, and who knows what else. The damage inflicted by Israel has not been rebuilt. Large areas of the country, particularly in the south, still lie in ruins. And the argument of Western and Gulf donor nations has been that there will be no reconstruction funds until Hezbollah is disarmed. Following previous wars, it would have been Iran that would have footed the bill. But those funds are not likely to come again in the same fashion. As we've said, militarily speaking, the future for Hezbollah looks limited. But they are also a political party, with members of parliament and seats in the cabinet. Prior to the war, Hezbollah enjoyed a good level of support among the country's Shia population. But it was this same population that suffered most during the war. A lack of polling data means it's difficult to gauge current levels of support among the Shia population, but an exodus of voters from Hezbollah is not guaranteed.
It's also worth remembering that up until now, there's no viable kind of third way alternative for the Lebanese Shia community in terms of political representation. We've seen that there are some figures who hold themselves out as being part of a kind of independent Shia opposition, but up until now, they haven't really been able to gain traction as a viable political option for people. And then there's also a concern which Hezbollah's opponents raise all the time, which is that having a third way beyond the two main Shia parties, Hezbollah and Harakat Amal, would never really be possible until Hezbollah disarms. And their argument being that as long as Hezbollah has its own independent arsenal, that would kind of cast a shadow over voters' minds and mean that many voters would be scared to vote against the party or to abandon it.
So, if Hezbollah can get the vote out, is this their path to greater political power and influence?
Well, they have a lot of political strength in their community. And electorally, yes. I mean, the base of Hezbollah that voted for them 3 years ago absolutely will vote for them again. That is kind of like an identity that will endure for a long time. But the way the Lebanese parliament is designed, the Lebanese constitution, Shiites all told have 27 seats out of 128. And those 27 seats are shared between Hezbollah and Amal. It's not all Hezbollah. So 27 out of 128, and of those Hezbollah maybe is 12. It doesn't translate into an enormous, power within the parliament or the state. Previously, they could rely on, first of all, the Amal movement, that whatever Nasrallah decided, Birri had to go along. So they had definitely 27. They don't have 27 anymore. And they had a pretty solid alliance with the Aunist movement, which gave them another 20 or something in the Christian camp. When they were very strong, and when the Assad government was still in place, other members of parliament, seeing the power balance and the Assad regime and Iran and Syria, would go along with, something if Nasrallah wanted it. So they used to be close to dominant in parliament. They lost that in the last elections, and now they've really lost it.
The Lebanese constitution limits the number of Shiite members of parliament, as it also does with Sunnis and Christians. Once, Hezbollah could rely on the support of Amal, the other Shiite party, and a handful of others to push through their demands and move the parliament the way they want. Part of that support was built on the knowledge that Hezbollah has a powerful militia backing it up. That's gone now, and is unlikely to return in any meaningful way. Hezbollah today is a shadow of their former self, and the path back looks extremely difficult, if not impossible. Which begs the question, who are they? What do they stand for now? What are they offering? Paul Salem.
They also used to get hundreds of millions or billions from Iran and pay everybody and rebuild everything. They were a winning team with a bright future, tons of money and tons of jobs. Now they don't have all of those things. Plus, it's not clear what Hezbollah will now campaign on. If they're to remain a political party, and if indeed they are eventually disarmed, they have to completely rethink who they are as a party.
Final words to David Wood.
I don't think it's an exaggeration to describe Hezbollah as being in an existential crisis right now, given that Hezbollah needs to decide what it wants to be in the future. And it is looking very difficult, as circumstances are right now, to see Hezbollah returning to the same level of armed resistance that it offered before this latest war started between Israel and Hezbollah. If Hezbollah is going to reduce its military wing and its armed resistance appeal to its voters, it needs to replace that appeal with something else. The most obvious path on that would be to provide services for its supporters like a normal political party does, and that would be starting with reconstruction. However, that's also going to be very difficult for Hezbollah, given that it isn't just facing pressure to disarm from the international community and from its domestic opponents, but the international community is also very deliberately trying to strangle Hezbollah's sources of revenue in a financial sense. So for that reason, Hezbollah finds itself in a very difficult position, because not only has it suffered enormous damage to its military capabilities, and that continues as Israel continues to attack it, but also it's faced severe damage to its financial networks. And even though various sources say that Hezbollah is still managing to get money into the country, it's clearly not flowing to anywhere near the degree that it was before this war started. So for that reason, Hezbollah finds itself in a very difficult position where even if the party leadership wanted to disarm, believing that there was no other way forward, they may not know exactly what path they could walk down after doing that, which again plays in favor, probably from the party's perspective, of trying to buy time to see whether these adverse circumstances will change.
This episode of The New Arab Voice was written and produced by me, Hugo Goodridge. Our theme music was by Omar El-Fil. The New Arab Voice will be back with a new episode shortly. Don't forget to subscribe to get notified when a new episode drops. You can find the link in the show notes. Until then, you can find all our previous episodes on all major podcast platforms. You can also check out our social media accounts on Instagram and X, both at TNA Podcasts, for additional content. And you can email us, podcast@newarab.com. That's podcast@newarab.com. You can subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and you can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Don't forget to follow The New Arab on Facebook, X and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region.